Tonight, the world grows distant. The noise of modern life fades first, then its light, then its urgency, until there is only darkness, candle fire, and the long remembering silence of Hampton Court Palace. It is very late, late enough that the palace no longer feels like a home of kings. It feels like a place where memory has chosen to stay. The fires are low now, breathing softly behind iron grates. Candlelight trembles over carved oak, worn gold, and ancient tapestries, where queens and saints, hunts and gardens drift in and out of shadow like fragments of a dream too sorrowful to vanish. The corridors stretch into stillness. The doors are shut. The laughter is gone. And yet, the palace does not feel empty. It feels full of what was never safely spoken. Beyond the windows, England lies under mist and black water. The river moves unseen through the night. The gardens sleep beneath the cold. But inside these walls there lingers another kind of chill. Not the chill of weather, but of waiting, of dread, of prayers whispered in loneliness, of tears that could not be shed until no one was there to witness them. Tonight, we turn away from the great noise of history, away from battles, decrees, triumphs, and the glittering theater of kingship. Instead, we come closer to something quieter and far more devastating. 6 women, 6 queens, 6 lives drawn into the radiance of power and scorched by it. History has made them easy to recite, almost like a pattern, almost like a song. But there was nothing light in what they endured. These were not names arranged for memory. They were living women, women who loved, women who feared, women who waited through sleepless nights, listening for footsteps, knowing that the mood of one man could alter not only their own fate, but the fate of everyone around them. Beneath the jewels, there was breath. Beneath the velvet, there was pain. Beneath the crown, there was always a private self still hoping not to disappear. And perhaps that is what Hampton Court remembers best. Not the pageantry, not the gold, not even the king, but the women and the quiet suffering hidden beneath magnificence. A queen standing motionless while her attendants unfasten her sleeves, a wife kneeling in prayer, asking heaven for what the earth will not give. A woman sitting awake beside a dying candle, too full of sorrow to trust herself to sleep. A woman hearing footsteps approach her door, and feeling, in that one suspended moment, how fragile a life can become when it rests in the hands of power. To be married to Henry VIII was to live inside splendor and terror at once, to be adored and appraised, to be elevated and endangered, to understand that his love was never merely love. It was favor, it was law, it was appetite. It was a force warm enough to make a woman feel chosen by destiny, and cold enough to leave her standing alone in its shadow. So tonight, we move gently among these women, not as legends, not as victims reduced to endings, but as human souls who breathed beneath silk, endured beneath ceremony, and carried private grief through some of the most glittering rooms in England. Let the candles burn lower now. Let the corridors darken. Let the palace remember. And in that tender, haunted hush, let us begin with the first queen, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon belongs to the kind of sorrow that does not cry out. It settles into the room before she does. If you were standing quietly in the corner of her chamber at Hampton Court, if you were only a witness, unseen and unheard, you might first notice not her crown, not the richness of her gown, not the solemn grandeur history has wrapped around her name, but her tiredness. Not the tiredness of a single bad night, a deeper weariness than that. the kind that lives in the shoulders, in the hands, in the eyes that have learned to remain calm while the heart is being asked to bear more than it should. She had once been young. That is the first tenderness to remember. Before the years of waiting, before the humiliations, before the whispers that gathered around her marriage like cold mist, she had been a young woman carried far from home into a strange kingdom, toward a future she could not yet see. And perhaps, in those earlier years, if you had seen her walking through torchlit halls or kneeling in chapel with her face lifted toward prayer, you might have felt that she believed in the shape of her life, believed in marriage, believed in duty, believed that if she gave enough of herself with grace and constancy, the world would hold. And for a while, perhaps it did. But tonight, in this chamber, you do not meet the girl she was. You meet the woman who stayed. The woman who kept faith after warmth had begun to leave the marriage bed. The woman who continued to dress herself in dignity after love had turned its face elsewhere. The woman who learned, with every passing year, that splendor cannot protect the heart from shame. Imagine her now. The chamber is warm, but not warmly lived in. The fire is low and red behind its grate. Candlelight shivers gently across the carved wood, across the tapestry on the wall, across the rich folds of fabric laid over chairs and stools. Her ladies have withdrawn a little. Their hands, moments ago, were busy with ribbons and clasps and sleeves, but now the room is quieter. It has that late-night stillness in which no one wishes to speak first, because everyone can feel that something tender is near the surface. And there she is, still upright, still composed. But if you were close enough, if you could truly see her as she is, and not as ceremony required her to appear, you might notice how slowly she lowers herself into the chair beside the fire, how careful the movement is, how her body seems to carry not only the weight of velvet and embroidery, but the weight of years, the weight of pregnancies, the weight of griefs endured in private, and then folded away because queens are not allowed to collapse. This is what history rarely lets us feel, that her sorrow lived in her body. It lived in the memory of children lost before they could be held long enough to become ordinary. It lived in the dull ache after childbirth, in the weakness after fever, in the empty space where hope had swelled and then broken. Again and again, she was asked to begin once more. Again and again, the kingdom placed its future inside her body. Again and again, she endured the loneliness of being looked at not as a woman in pain, but as a vessel that had failed to deliver certainty. If you stood in that room and watched her place one hand against her breast, or close her eyes for a moment longer than rest alone would require, you might feel something almost unbearable then. Not pity exactly, something gentler than that. The ache of seeing how hard she has worked to remain whole. There is a special sadness in watching a woman keep her dignity, because dignity is all that is left to her. You can feel it in the silence around Catherine. No sobbing, no dramatics, no collapse, only restraint, only a face trained by faith and discipline not to betray too much, only the terrible courage of remaining calm while humiliation moves closer each day. And humiliation did move closer. Not all at once. That would almost be kinder. No, it came in the slow Tudor way. Through looks, omissions, altered tones, through the growing awareness that affection had gone elsewhere, and the court had begun to lean toward the new warmth. Imagine what that must feel like before anyone dares speak it plainly. to enter a room and know, before a single word is said, that something has shifted, to sense conversation tightening around you, to feel yourself being observed not with love, but with assessment, to understand, little by little, that your place is no longer secure, even though you have done everything that was asked of you. You can almost see the knowledge entering her, not like a blow, like cold, like standing too long beside a window in winter and only slowly realizing that the chill has passed through silk and linen and settled inside the bones, and still she does not bend. That is what makes her so moving when you come close to her in imagination. She is hurt, but she will not beg. She is lonely, but she will not cheapen her sorrow by displaying it for comfort. She is frightened, perhaps more than she lets anyone see, and yet she refuses to surrender the truth of who she believes herself to be. This is not stubbornness in the small sense. It is something larger. A woman's whole life saying, "I was wife, I am wife. I did not dream this. I did not imagine the vows. I did not invent the years. I did not endure all this only to be told that my life can be set aside like an inconvenient page." If you were there with her, if you could have crossed the chamber and knelt beside her chair, perhaps the most heartbreaking thing would not be her sorrow itself, but the fact that she has no safe place to set it down. A queen cannot simply grieve, not openly, not fully. Even here, in the privacy of night, she must still remain herself. She must still remember how she is seen. She must still hold her back straight, her words measured, her expression governed. The court follows women even into solitude. That is one of the cruelties of power. It leaves very little room in which a heart may be unguarded. And then there is Mary. You feel her absence in the chamber almost as strongly as Catherine's presence, because once you begin to see Catherine not only as queen, but as mother, the sorrow changes shape. It becomes warmer and sharper at once. Whatever insult she suffered in her own person, whatever rejection she endured as wife, there was something crueler in seeing uncertainty spread toward her daughter. A mother can bear much injury to herself. It is harder to bear fear for a child, harder to lie awake in a curtained bed and think of your daughter sleeping elsewhere, watched by others, instructed by others, perhaps feeling abandoned, perhaps being told that the world which once held her secure has changed. Imagine Catherine in that hour, the fire lower now, the candle burned down, the chamber finally empty enough that she need not perform strength for anyone, and yet she is still holding herself together, not because it is easy, because she must. You might see her fingertips move over prayer beads. You might hear only the faintest whisper of breath as she prays, not for triumph, perhaps not even for vindication, but for strength enough to endure the next day without losing herself. And there is something so deeply human in that, so moving in its quietness, that the centuries between her life and yours begin to thin. She is no longer a painted queen in a rigid portrait. She is a woman trying not to break where others can see, a woman who has loved, hoped, lost, and been made to stand beneath the gaze of a court while her marriage was slowly unstitched around her. A woman whose body has suffered more than it is thanked for. A woman whose dignity is not ornament, but armor. And if you remain there in imagination a little longer, you may feel the true sadness of Catherine of Aragon. Not simply that she was set aside, but that she endured so much tenderness turned to coldness, so much faith met with calculation, so much private grief carried in public silence, and still had to rise each morning, dress, pray, and be seen. That is why her presence lingers, not because she was victorious, not because she was spared, but because there is something profoundly moving in the sight of a woman who has been wounded in the deepest places and still refuses to become less than herself. The chamber is nearly dark now. She lifts her face. The candle trembles. Her shadow reaches long across the wall, and in that frail, wavering light, you do not see a discarded queen. You see a woman who has suffered with extraordinary dignity, a woman whose heart has been pressed almost beyond bearing, and yet still beats with love, with faith, with sorrow, and with a quiet, unyielding strength. Anne Boleyn enters the night differently. With Catherine, the room seemed to grow still around sorrow. With Anne, the air feels changed before she even appears. If you were standing unseen in some candlelit chamber at Hampton Court, you might sense her before you saw her. Not because she was loud, but because she carried a brightness that unsettled everything near it. A quickness, a tension, a life in her that made stillness difficult. Even before she spoke, you would feel that she was noticing the room, who watched too closely, who looked away too fast, who was eager, who was afraid. Anne must have known what it was to be watched. Not merely admired, but watched. In a royal court, that kind of looking is never innocent. Men watched her because they desired her. Women watched her because they judged her, envied her, feared her, or measured themselves against her. Courtiers watched her because the king watched her, and once the king's desire fixed fully upon her, she could no longer belong to herself in any simple way. She became more than a woman in a room. She became a question in every room, a danger, a promise, a provocation. She was watched not only as a woman, but as an event. There must have been exhilaration in that at first. How could there not be? To be found fascinating, to be pursued, to feel that wit, speech, and presence could hold a king in suspense. For a moment, perhaps, she felt not only wanted, but singular. But in Anne's story, exhilaration never comes alone. It is always shadowed by strain, because the desire of Henry VIII was never the desire of an ordinary man. It carried weight. It pulled courts, councils, marriages, consciences, and ambitions behind it. To receive such desire was to feel the ground shifting beneath your feet. What raised Anne up also placed her in terrible danger. Imagine her late at night when the day is finally being unfastened from her. A lady lifts away the jeweled hood. Sleeves are loosened. Pearls are removed one by one. The room smells faintly of wax, warm fabric, and the ashes of a settling fire. Outside the windows, the Tudor dark presses softly against the glass. At last, she is left more nearly alone. She sits by the fire, but does not fully rest in it. The posture softens, but not completely. The hands grow still, but not easy. She looks like a woman who has learned that even silence must be listened to carefully. For Anne was not made to move through life half asleep. She was too vivid for that, too intelligent, too alive to atmosphere. And in a court like Henry's, that brightness was both her power and her burden. Then came the cruel, old demand laid upon queens. She too must prove everything through her body. She too must bear the son who would justify upheaval and secure the future. And when hope failed, the pain was not permitted to remain private. A miscarriage is grief enough in loving secrecy. In Anne's world, it was also judgment, whispering, calculation. Her sorrow became a matter of state. That is the cruelty of royal womanhood. A woman's most intimate heartbreak is scarcely hers before others begin to interpret it. And still, she must rise again. Still she must dress. Still she must appear. This is where Anne becomes truly heartbreaking, not only in the fall that history remembers, but in the strain that came before it, in the cost of being brilliant in a world that delights in a woman's brightness, then punishes her for it, in the slow dread that enters when favor begins to cool, in the loneliness of sensing, perhaps before anyone says it aloud, that the light once warming her has begun to turn. So if you imagine Anne at Hampton Court at the end of the day, do not imagine only the legend. Imagine the woman, bright, tense, desired, watched, and already perhaps beginning to feel how dangerous it is to stand so near the flame of power. Jane Seymour comes like a softer light after strain. After Anne, it is almost startling to imagine a woman whose presence does not sharpen a room, but quiets it. And yet quietness has its own sadness, its own vulnerability, its own cost. If you stood unseen in her chamber at Hampton Court, late at night after the court had gone to rest, you might not first be struck by brilliance or force, but by gentleness held very carefully, as though it too could be broken. Jane feels like a woman who understood the safety of softness, not weakness, not emptiness, something more guarded than that, a way of moving through danger without seeming to disturb it, lowered eyes, measured speech, a calm manner that keeps the inward life veiled. In a court where attention could burn, she must have known the value of not dazzling too much. And perhaps that is why her story feels so tender. She enters rooms already wounded by what came before. She walks through galleries where memory still clings to the walls. Every glance toward her carries comparison. Even her quietness is read as remedy. That is a lonely kind of hope to carry. For hope gathers around Jane from every side. The hope of peace, the hope of a gentler queen, the hope of a son. Too much is placed upon her, and she receives it all with that careful stillness which grows more moving the longer one looks at it. Imagine her alone at night. The jeweled pins are removed, the heavier gown loosened. Candlelight softens the face that daylight must keep composed. Now she looks less like a queen than a young woman trying not to show how tired she is. The body relaxes slowly, as though it has spent the whole day remembering not to take up too much space. And still, there may have been real hope in her. That matters. Not only obedience, not only composure, hope. The private wish that she might bring not only an heir, but some easing of old wounds, that perhaps a household could grow gentler around her, that perhaps the king might rest in a woman who did not challenge or inflame, but soothed. There is something deeply moving in hope of that kind, because it does not blaze, it glows, and yet it asks everything of the body. For in Jane's world, hope must become flesh. It must grow quietly within her beneath silk, ceremony, and watchfulness. Pregnancy would have brought not privacy, but scrutiny. Her face, her movements, her appetite, the changing shape of her body, all observed, all interpreted. A young woman trying to remain calm while a kingdom silently hangs upon her womb. And at night, when the court falls away, the feeling must have grown larger. The altered breath, the heaviness in the body, the wakefulness that comes when expectation is too great for sleep. The room is warm. The hangings hush the drafts. One hand rests over the child moving quietly within her, and perhaps she prays without words. Let this be enough. Let me be enough. That is the sadness at the heart of queenship. A woman's worth is tied to the survival of something she cannot fully command. When the birth finally comes, all of Hampton Court must have seemed to hold its breath. The heat of the chamber, the effort, the pain that strips away ceremony and leaves only endurance. Inside that room, a queen is no symbol at all, but a woman in extremity, flesh and fear and strength. Then at last, the child is born, a son. For one brief shining span of time, Jane must have felt wrapped in something like peace, not merely approved, not merely safe, cherished, fulfilled in the one way Tudor queens were taught to understand fulfillment. And that is why what follows feels so unbearably sad, because after all that waiting, after all that hope, after all that pain transformed into triumph, her body does not return to safety. This is the grief at the center of Jane Seymour's story. She did everything that was asked of her. Everything. She was gentle. She was careful. She bore the prince. And still the cost was her life. When illness comes after childbirth, joy turns strange almost at once. Weakness where there should be recovery. Fever where there should be relief. The room that so recently held congratulations grows quieter, dimmer, more afraid. Faces try to reassure and fail. The queen, who should be rising slowly into honored motherhood, lies back upon the pillows, too pale, too tired, drifting further from the life she has just secured for others. If you imagine her then, it is almost impossible not to feel tenderness. She is still very young. The child she longed to give the king now lives in the world, and yet she herself is slipping away from it. The irony is almost too sorrowful to bear. The body that succeeds is the body that breaks. So see her there in the last hush of her night, the curtains partly drawn, the air heavy with warmth and sickness, a candle burning low, a lady dabbing her brow, someone kneeling in prayer, and Jane, pale against the linens, no longer seeming like a queen at all, but like a young woman who carried hope carefully inside her and paid too dearly for its fulfillment. That is how she lingers, not in splendor, in tenderness, in the sorrow of a hope that flowered and faded almost at once. Anne of Cleves enters the night with distance around her, not coldness, something gentler than that, and sadder. If you stood unseen in one of Hampton Court's quieter chambers, watching candlelight settle over unfamiliar fabrics, over a traveling chest not yet fully unpacked, over a woman who has crossed the sea into a life that does not know how to welcome her except by judging her, you would feel at once the loneliness of arriving where others have already decided what you are. That is a particular kind of sorrow, not the sorrow of guilt, the sorrow of being measured before you are known. Anne comes to England as a bride, but also as an agreement made flesh. Alliance, diplomacy, religion, expectation, all are placed upon her body before her new life has even begun. The room prepared for her may be richly furnished. The fire may burn warmly. Attendants may move with respect. And yet nothing truly belongs to her. Not the language, not the habits of the household, not the silences around her. Even kindness must have felt uncertain in a place so foreign. And then, worst of all, the husband. What must it feel like to cross into marriage and sense, almost at once, that disappointment has entered before tenderness ever could? Stay close to that feeling. Not scandal, not comedy, humiliation. The quiet bodily humiliation of understanding that the man who is meant to receive you has already drawn inward from you. A woman does not need every word explained. She knows when warmth does not arrive. She knows when a face cools, when a gaze hesitates, when nearness fails to become welcome. And Anne must have known. That is what makes her so moving. Not that she was rejected, but that she had to bear rejection in full ceremony. A lesser hurt can be wept over in private. Hers moved through corridors, Counsels, formal gestures, careful voices. She had to rise, dress, appear, and feel all around her, the delicate stiffness of a marriage already empty at its center. If you watched her at night after such a day, you might notice how controlled her sadness is. It does not spill outward. It gathers in smaller things, the stillness of her hands, the extra moment she remains by the fire after the room has emptied, the way she turns toward warmth as though it might answer a loneliness that words cannot ease. There is deep sadness in estrangement, not the sharp grief of sudden loss, a quieter ache, to be out of place in one's own marriage, to feel that one's body has become the site of someone else's disappointment, to sense that others are speaking gently because the truth is too awkward to name plainly. And yet Anne of Cleves possesses something quietly admirable, a steadiness that saves her. Not Catherine's sacramental endurance, not Anne Boleyn's dangerous brightness, something more practical than either. She seems to understand, sooner than many might have, that survival matters more than wounded pride. Once the truth becomes clear, she does not destroy herself begging for a tenderness that will not be given. There is dignity in that, a quiet dignity, the kind that does not dazzle, but preserves a life. Imagine the days when the truth can no longer be softened. The king does not come toward her with warmth. The palace knows. The council knows. She knows. And now the question is no longer whether she will be loved, but whether she can emerge without ruin. That must have been a lonely knowledge, to feel the heart step back from hope and the mind move towards safety. This is where Anne of Cleves becomes deeply human. She cannot control the story told about her. She does not choose the king's disappointment. She does not shape the comparisons, the whispers, the private dismissals. And yet, she must live within their consequences. How often women have had to do exactly that, to make a life inside conditions defined by someone else's desire or someone else's distaste. Anne's greatness, if we may call it that, lies here. She yields where yielding preserves her. She steps sideways out of danger. And though the world may call that submission, there is intelligence in it. Strong, sorrowful intelligence. Not every act of survival looks grand from the outside. Some are quiet. Some happen in private, when a woman understands that one hope must be surrendered so that the rest of her life may remain intact. Still, relief is not the same as joy. Yes, she is safe. Yes, she is treated generously. Yes, she remains honored. But safety after rejection has its own silence. You can imagine her afterward in a chamber no longer belonging to a queen, yet still warm, still proper, still comfortable. The danger has passed. Respect remains. And still, the heart must live with what was never given. Not even great passion. Simply welcome. The ordinary human comfort of being wanted where one has been placed. That is what lingers most. Not drama, not ridicule, but the sadness of a woman far from home, learning to survive by accepting less than intimacy. So let her remain with you for a moment in the late Tudor hush. The jewels set aside, the bodice loosened, her hands held slightly toward the fire. The room softened by candlelight, though never fully made into home. And Anne of Cleves, in all her estranged dignity, becomes one of the quiet sorrows of the palace. Not shattered, not consumed, simply left to gather herself after disappointment, and, with admirable calm, choose life. Catherine Howard enters the night like a candle burning too brightly in a draught. At first, if you saw her only from a distance, you might think her story would be the lightest of them all. She is young, so young that youth still clings to her even beneath the weight of queenship. There is softness in her face, quickness in her manner, something bright and girlish still alive in her movements. In a palace burdened by illness, memory, and old disappointment, she must have seemed like sudden music, a little warmth in winter, a little color returning to a faded room. And perhaps that is what makes her sorrow so piercing, because youth can look so much like safety from the outside, but it is not. If you stood unseen in her chamber at Hampton Court, after the candles had burned low and the last attendants had withdrawn a little way, I do not think what would move you first would be her beauty. I think it would be her fragility, the sense that she is still becoming herself, still learning where the edges of danger lie, still too young to understand that in a court like this, delight and peril can wear the same face. She had been looked at for a long time before she truly knew what it meant to be seen. That is one of the great sadnesses of her life. Some women arrive in danger by ambition, some by conviction, some by misfortune. Catherine Howard seems to arrive there partly by youth itself, by having been admired, handled, spoken for, and drawn into adult appetite before she possessed the inward steadiness to defend her own tenderness. It is difficult not to feel for her when one imagines this closely, not as an emblem of folly, but as a very young woman shaped too early by the eyes and wants of others. At Hampton Court, where everything was magnified by power, her youth would have been both ornament and exposure. Imagine her in bright fabrics chosen for her, jewels laid against a throat that still carries something of girlhood in its delicacy. Imagine the excitement of attention, the flattery, the sense of having risen into extraordinary fortune. She is queen now. The king smiles upon her. Rooms warm when she enters. Courtiers bend nearer. Her face matters. Her laughter matters. Her nearness matters. For someone so young, such sudden elevation must have felt like being lifted into sunlight. And yet, sunlight can blind. If you were near enough in imagination, you might begin to notice small things beneath the brightness. How quickly her mood might shift after the room empties. How still she becomes once no one is watching. How youth, when it has been made to perform delight, can collapse afterward into a weariness almost childlike. Perhaps she sits before a mirror while a lady draws pins from her hair. Perhaps her smile fades the moment she no longer needs it. Perhaps her eyes, reflected in the dimming glass, look not triumphant, but uncertain. That uncertainty is the beginning of compassion. Because Catherine Howard's life seems full of moments in which she did not fully grasp the terms upon which she was being loved. To be adored by Henry VIII at this stage in his life was not like being courted by a young prince. It was to become the object of an aging king's need, his appetite for renewal, for beauty, for proof that desire still answered him. Such attention may have felt intoxicating. It may also have felt impossible to refuse, and once accepted, it placed her inside a world of scrutiny, harsh beyond her years. Think of her at night. That is where the heart of her story lies. Not in public splendor, but in the chamber after midnight, when the courtesies are done, and the body at last speaks back. The jewels are heavy until they are removed. The ceremonial silks, so lovely by candlelight in hall and chapel, become stiff and tiring after hours upon the skin. The palace is vast, but her room may suddenly feel small. Outside, the galleries stretch into darkness. Inside, the fire settles with little sighing sounds, and the silence after laughter can feel immense. A young woman alone in such silence may hear her own thoughts too clearly. Did she feel safe? Truly safe? I do not think so. Not deep down. Even before accusation, even before fear sharpened into terror, there is something about Catherine Howard that suggests inward unease. The kind born when affection has always carried risk. The kind that makes a person eager to please, eager to be cherished, eager to stay in favor, yet never fully able to trust that favor will last. Such unease does not always show itself openly. It lives in the body, in the quick breath, in the nerves that do not easily settle, in the smile that appears swiftly and disappears just as quickly when no one needs to see it. And then the whispers begin. There is a point in every downfall when the world is still outwardly intact, yet the person at its center begins to feel the floor shift. You can almost sense that moment in Catherine Howard's story, a servant's changed expression, a silence that lingers too long, a conversation interrupted at her approach, the dawning realization that something once buried has begun to rise toward the surface, and that it is rising inside a court where mercy is thin. If you imagine her then, your heart cannot help but move toward her. Because this is where youth meets terror, not abstract fear, not shame in the mild sense, terror with physical edges, the throat tightening, the stomach hollowing, the hands going cold and staying cold, sleep breaking in the middle of the night because the body already knows what the mind is trying not to say. Perhaps she sits upright in bed, the curtains around her breathing slightly with the draft, listening for sounds in the corridor. Perhaps the darkness feels alive with possibility. Perhaps every distant footstep seems to carry judgment. And because she is so young, because she has not yet built the hard inner scaffolding that older women sometimes acquire through long suffering, fear reaches her in a rawer way. It does not become dignity, it becomes panic, pleading, a desperate wish to turn back time, to unsay, to undo, to slip once more into the protected ignorance that is no longer available. This is the cruelty of Catherine Howard's story. That understanding comes too late for innocence to matter, too late for charm to save her, too late for the bright surface of queenship to conceal anything. The same palace that once reflected her delight now seems to close in around her. The corridors are colder. The familiar rooms feel strange. Even light looks different when one is afraid. Candlelight no longer flatters. It exposes. Silk no longer adorns. It seems flimsy, defenseless, almost childish against the gravity of accusation. The great walls of Hampton Court, so splendid by day, become at night the walls of a place where no door can truly keep danger out. And still, somewhere within her fear, there must have been disbelief. The young often believe, until the last possible moment, that disaster cannot be as final as adults say it is, that someone will intervene, that tears will soften hearts, that explanations will matter, that the beloved figure at the center of everything will remember tenderness. But Henry's court was not built to protect frightened girls. It was built to protect authority. And once authority turned against her, Catherine Howard's youth, which had once been her brightest currency, became almost part of the tragedy itself. Imagine one of those last inward moments of clarity. Not the spectacle history records, something smaller. She is alone for a little while. The room is dim. Her hands, when she clasps them together, will not grow warm. Her breathing comes shallowly and then too fast. She is trying to be still, perhaps because movement only makes the fear sharper. There is no audience now, no courtly part to play, no way to smile her way back into safety. Only a young woman and the terrible knowledge that what once seemed survivable has become something else entirely. I think that is the image that lingers most painfully. Not scandal, not punishment. A frightened young woman understanding, with the slowness of shock, that the world has ceased to be negotiable. And if you stand there with her in imagination, if you do not turn away into easy moral judgment, you may feel something very tender and sad, the recognition that she was not ready for the scrutiny, not ready for the king, not ready for the ruthless logic of a court that could adorn a girl one season and condemn her the next. Her mistakes may have been real, her choices imperfect, her understanding incomplete. But beneath all of that is a human truth more powerful than condemnation. She was young, she was frightened, and fear, when it enters a young body, has a soundless poignancy all its own. The tears she could not shed in public, the shame she could not explain away, the memory of earlier moments that must have returned now with horrible vividness. All of it would have pressed upon her in the sleepless dark. And there is no comfort in Hampton Court for such a night. The palace may offer walls, fires, attendants, prayers, but none of these can reach the deepest chamber of terror once a person knows that favor has turned to peril. So let yourself see her gently, not as a cautionary tale, not as the pretty wife who failed, but as a young woman in candlelight, wrapped in fear she cannot master, listening to the enormous silence of the palace and understanding at last how alone she is. That is Catherine Howard in the night, youth without shelter, beauty without safety, a heart beating too fast in the dark. And when the candle shakes and her shadow quivers on the wall, it is not the shadow of a queen secure in ornament. It is the shadow of a frightened girl who has wandered too near the furnace of power and has understood too late that it will not spare her. Catherine Parr enters the night with a different kind of stillness, not the stillness of innocence, not the stillness of youth, a steadier thing than that. Something earned, something held in place with thought. If you were standing quietly in the shadows of one of Hampton Court's later chambers, while the candles burned low and the palace settled around the weariness of an aging reign, you might not at first be struck by beauty or by fragility. What you would notice in Catherine Parr is presence, a composed and wakeful presence, the kind that belongs to a woman who has learned through experience that feeling deeply and showing wisely are not always the same thing. By the time she came to Henry, she was no girl stepping into splendor with a startled heart. She knew enough of life to understand sorrow before it arrived. She knew enough of marriage to understand that companionship may carry duty in one hand and loneliness in the other. She knew enough of court and religion and power to recognize that words themselves could wound or rescue or endanger. And perhaps that is why her part of the night feels so inwardly alive. Not bright like Anne Boleyn, not trembling like Catherine Howard, not grave in the old sacramental way of Catherine of Aragon. Catherine Parr feels like a woman whose mind remains awake even when the palace longs for sleep. Imagine her chamber, not bare, but more thoughtful than decorative. A book left open, a prayer written in a careful hand, candlelight falling across a page where the ink has not long dried. The fire is lower than it once would have been in the household of a younger king. The air of Henry's later years seems heavier somehow, touched by illness, medicine, fatigue. Outside the room, the palace still follows its rituals, but more slowly, more cautiously. There is less of youth in it now, less of the gleaming confidence of earlier decades, more pain, more memory, more waiting. And into this atmosphere, Catherine Parr steps not as enchantment, but as steadiness. That is moving in its own way. Because there are women whose tenderness takes the form of brightness, and women whose tenderness takes the form of care. Catherine seems to belong to the second kind. You can imagine her moving through the king's rooms with calm attentiveness, noting what is needed before it is spoken. A cushion adjusted, a conversation steered gently away from irritation, a silence kept when silence is wiser than speech. To live near Henry in these later years was to live near his suffering as well as his power. His body pained him. His temper was sharpened by discomfort. His vanity remained alive even where youth had departed. To be his wife now was not to dance at the center of a glittering courtship. It was to remain composed beside a throne that had become, in part, a sickbed. There is loneliness in that role too. A quieter loneliness than the others perhaps, but no less real. For Catherine Parr had a mind of her own. She was learned, thoughtful, drawn toward religious reflection, interested in ideas, in language, in the shaping of inward life. Imagine, then, what it means for such a woman to spend her days not in free conversation, but in careful management of another's mood. To know one could say much, and yet must say only what the moment can bear. To feel thought pressing warmly at the edges of the mind, while caution lays its cool hand over the mouth. That tension is deeply human. How many people have known some version of it? The discipline of not speaking all one feels. The fatigue of measuring every word in a room where power is listening. If you watched Catherine alone at night, after the duties of attendance had ended, this is what might move you most. The moment when she is finally returned to herself. She enters her chamber with the day still clinging to her. The formal gown is loosened, the jewels removed, the body exhales. But the mind does not fully rest. It turns instead toward page and prayer, toward thought, toward those deeper chambers of the self that the court cannot entirely regulate. Perhaps she sits beside a candle with a book open before her, one hand resting against the margin, not reading yet, only breathing in the first true quiet she has had all day. Perhaps her feet ache from long hours on stone. Perhaps her shoulders bear the faint stiffness of restraint. Perhaps her face, in that gentler light, shows not merely intelligence, but tired compassion. Not only for the king, perhaps for the royal children too, for Mary and Elizabeth and Edward, all drawn into the complicated weather of this family. There is something particularly moving in imagining Catherine Parr as a woman trying to create islands of gentleness in a hard place, to reconcile where she can, to care where she can, to keep alive some inward flame of thought, decency, and tenderness while living beside a man who could still, at any moment, become dangerous. And danger did come. Not with the theatrical force that history often prefers, but in a subtler, colder form. Accusation, suspicion. The possibility that her learning, her religious seriousness, her habit of discussing matters of faith might be turned against her. Imagine what that must have felt like, not for a naive girl, but for a woman fully capable of understanding consequences. She would not have met danger with youthful disbelief. She would have recognized it in the changed air of a room, in the careful wording of others, in the way certain names begin to circulate, in the knowledge that even affection, even marriage, offers no shelter if power decides to reinterpret a wife's virtues as faults. That kind of fear is very refined and therefore very intimate. It does not always make a person cry. Sometimes it sharpens the mind instead. Sometimes it sends a cold clarity through the body. One imagines Catherine at such a moment, alone after receiving some hint, some warning, some sign that she is being weighed. The chamber is still. The candle before her burns in a steady pool of wax. Her hands lie quiet, but too quiet. Inside, thought is moving quickly. She understands at once what is at stake. She understands that there are men who would gladly undo her. She understands that if the king's mood tilts the wrong way, all her care, all her usefulness, all her intelligence may suddenly become nothing. How brave a woman must be to go on calmly after such knowledge. Not dramatic bravery, the older, subtler kind. To rise the next morning and choose her words with perfect care. To approach the king not in panic, but in wisdom. To soothe where she might have argued. To defer where she might have defended. To protect her life not by denying her mind, but by knowing when the heart of survival lies in gentle retreat. This is what makes Catherine Parr deeply admirable. She is not spared fear. She masters its expression. She understands that power often needs to be reassured before it can be appeased, and so she gives Henry what he can accept: the appearance of submission, the comfort of authority, the sense that he remains unquestioned. Some might call this compromise, but standing close to her in the night, it feels more like mature courage, the courage to preserve life without surrendering inward substance, the courage to bend without breaking. And because of that, she survives. That word settles softly here. Survives. After Catherine of Aragon's endurance without relief, after Anne Boleyn's scorching rise and fall, after Jane's fatal fulfillment, after Anne of Cleves' lonely adjustment, after Catherine Howard's terror, Catherine Parr remains. What must that feel like after all she has seen? To outlive the danger not untouched, but intact enough to step beyond it. There is relief in that, surely, yet not pure relief. Survival often carries its own sadness. One has had to know too much. One has had to be careful too long. One has had to move through chambers of affection and fear so closely joined that even freedom, when it comes, feels fragile at first. Imagine her after Henry's death. Not jubilant, not suddenly transformed into ease. Rather, quiet, deeply quiet. The palace itself changed by absence. The old pressure lifted, and yet the rooms still remember it. Catherine, now beyond the immediate reach of the king's moods, may at last breathe more fully. But a woman who has lived long in caution does not instantly forget how caution feels in the body. The shoulders do not entirely drop. The nerves do not immediately unlearn their listening. Relief comes gently, cautiously, like thaw after a hard winter. And still, there must have been moments in which she felt the extraordinary tenderness of continued life. To wake and not dread a summons, to read without fear, to speak more freely, to imagine a future that is not arranged around another person's appetite, pain, or volatility. Such moments do not erase what came before, but they soften it. They return a woman, little by little, to herself. That is why Catherine Parr's section of the night feels like survival rather than triumph. Triumph is too bright a word. Her story ends in something quieter and more deeply moving. Endurance refined by intelligence, fear answered with tact, tenderness practiced under pressure, and life preserved by a woman who understood both danger and herself. So let yourself see her now in the final hush of her chamber. The book is closed. The candle is lower. The palace beyond the walls is sinking into the dark. She sits for a moment beside the fire, one hand resting in her lap, the other near the arm of the chair, her face thoughtful in profile. There is tiredness in her, yes, but there is also composure. Not the brittle composure of suppression, something gentler, more inhabited. The composure of a woman who has passed through fear and remains capable of care. And if you stand beside her in imagination, the feeling she leaves you with is not excitement, nor even sorrow alone. It is respect. Respect touched by pity. Pity touched by warmth. The sense of a fully human woman who knew how precarious life beside power could be, and who still managed, somehow, to keep alive within herself a quiet center of thought, compassion, and grace. That is Catherine Parr in the night, careful, intelligent, tired, alive. And as her candle burns lower and the palace settles into its oldest silence, she becomes the soft final note in the long, emotional music of Henry's wives. Not because she suffered least, but because she carried suffering with understanding and endured long enough to step, at last, beyond the shadow that had claimed so many others. Now the palace is very quiet. The fires have sunk low into red and breathing embers. The candles, burned nearly to their sockets, give a gentler light than before. The long galleries are empty. The doors are closed. The silks are folded away. The jewels are sleeping in their chests. And all that remains, in this deep and tender hour, is the hush that comes after power has finished speaking. If you stand still enough in imagination, if you let your mind rest here a little longer, Hampton Court no longer feels like a monument. It feels like a place that has absorbed feeling. A place that remembers without words. Here, perhaps, a woman once paused before entering a room and steadied her breath. Here, a hand once tightened around a rosary in the dark. Here, another woman sat before a dying fire, too alert to sleep, listening for footsteps that did not come, or fearing the ones that would. Here, a mother prayed for a daughter. Here, a young queen touched her own throat and wondered whether love had already begun to cool. Here, another lay pale after giving everything her body had to give. Here, a foreign bride learned the shape of loneliness in a language not her own. Here, a frightened girl discovered too late that beauty cannot bargain with fear. Here, a careful woman closed her book, lowered her eyes, and survived by knowing exactly when not to speak. And so the palace keeps them, not as portraits, not as pageantry, not as the neat little rhyme that history repeats because repetition is easier than feeling. It keeps them as women. Women who were expected to be symbols and still remained human beneath the weight of it. Women who felt the pressure of jewels against the skin, the stiffness of ceremony in the spine, the dread that enters a room before bad news is spoken aloud. Women who knew what it was to be watched too closely, to be wanted for what they might produce, to be judged by the changing weather of a king's heart, and to carry, under all the velvet and gold, the ordinary tender life of the body, a pulse, a breath, an ache, a hope, a fear no one else must see. Perhaps that is why their stories still move us. Not because they were queens alone, but because they were vulnerable in ways we still understand. They waited for love and found uncertainty. They tried to please and were not protected. They endured humiliation in silence. They carried sorrow privately while the world looked on publicly. They learned that power can enter the most intimate places of life: marriage, motherhood, prayer, sleep, and leave no corner untouched. Yet still, in each of them, something human remained luminous. In Catherine of Aragon, the dignity that would not yield. In Anne Boleyn, the vivid mind that would not dim itself for safety. In Jane Seymour, the fragile hope that glowed softly and was gone too soon. In Anne of Cleves, the wounded dignity that chose life over pride. In Catherine Howard, the heartbreaking youth that had never been given enough shelter. In Catherine Parr, the steady intelligence that carried her through danger without surrendering herself. They shared one king, but they did not share one fate. And even now, lying here at the edge of sleep, perhaps you can feel how different their silences were. Catherine's silence, prayerful and steadfast. Anne's silence, taut with thought. Jane's silence, full of hope and weakness. Anne of Cleves' silence, estranged and inward. Catherine Howard's silence, frightened and wakeful. Catherine Parr's silence, careful, learned, and enduring. The night gathers them all. It lays its soft darkness over grievance and desire, over childbirth and accusation, over rejection and survival. It softens the hard outlines of history and leaves behind something simpler and sadder and more merciful. Not queens arranged beneath a king's shadow, but women resting at last beyond the reach of judgment. Let the palace fade now. Let the chambers dim. Let the last candle burn smaller and smaller until its light is hardly more than a tremor in the dark. Outside, the Tudor night lies quiet over the river, over the gardens, over the sleeping fields of England. Inside, the old stones hold their chill. The tapestries hang unmoving. The hearth exhales one final warmth. And somewhere in that great sleeping house, memory settles gently back into silence. You do not need to follow it any farther. You do not need to hold all their sorrow awake. Only let it pass softly through you, as history sometimes can, not as noise, not as lesson, but as a tender human nearness. 6 women, 6 hearts, 6 lives touched by magnificence, fear, longing, and loss. And now, only the quiet remains. The palace breathes, the fire lowers, the candles fade, and beneath the vast and sleeping dark, the wives of Henry VIII drift back into stillness. And now, there is nothing more to ask of them tonight. Only rest. Only the long hush of Hampton Court, holding what it can no longer change. Sleep gently now, and let the old palace fall away into darkness. And now, the palace grows quiet again. The candles burn lower. The footsteps are gone. The doors have closed, and all that remains is the hush of old stone and the fading echo of 6 women who once moved through these rooms, with hope in their hearts, fear in their bodies, and destinies they could never fully command. There is nothing more to ask of them tonight. No more courage, no more grace, no more endurance, only rest, only darkness, only the slow mercy of night settling over Hampton Court, where so much was longed for, so much was suffered, and so much could never be undone. So sleep gently now. Let the palace recede. Let the river disappear into mist. Let the last candle go dim, and carry with you, just a little longer, the sorrow and tenderness of those women, until even they, at last, are folded into the dark.